Ambassador Ketvari had spent 400 years watching species rise and fall across the galaxy. His people, the Silent Sea, were the oldest living civilization in known space. They did not conquer. They did not trade. They simply watched and recorded everything. Every war, every peace treaty, every extinction event went into their archives. The Silent Sea believed that knowledge was the only thing worth keeping. When the humans of Earth sent their first ships beyond their solar system, the Silent Sea collective took notice. A new species was always interesting. Ketvari was chosen to observe them because he had studied over 2,000 different civilizations. He knew how to read the patterns. He knew how to predict which species would thrive and which would burn out like dying stars. He arrived on the human warship called the Resolute on a cold morning by Earth time. The ship was not impressive. It was functional and practical, built for long journeys rather than for show. The hull was scarred from previous battles. The corridors were narrow and filled with pipes and wires that more advanced species would have hidden away. Ketvari made a note in his log that human engineering was roughly 5,000 years behind the galactic standard. Captain Jake Morrison met him at the airlock. Morrison was a tall man with grey at his temples and calm blue eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He came from a place on Earth called Montana, which Ketvari later learned was known for its mountains and wide open space. Morrison shook Ketvari's hand, which was a human greeting ritual that involved gripping appendages. It seemed inefficient, but humans appeared to value physical contact. "Welcome aboard, Ambassador," Morrison said. "We're honored to have a Silent observer with us. I hope you find us interesting enough to write about." Ketvari did not tell the captain that he had already made his initial assessment. Humans were a young species, barely 10,000 years into their civilization. Their bodies were soft and fragile. They could not survive in vacuum without sweat. They could not regenerate lost limbs. They aged and died within a single century, which was barely enough time for a Silent child to learn basic mathematics. By all measurable standards, humans were unremarkable, but Ketvari was thorough. He would observe them properly before filing his final report. Over the next several weeks, he watched the crew of the Resolute go about their duties. He found them confusing. They wasted hours on activities that served no practical purpose. They played games with small pieces of paper that had pictures on them. They told each other stories that were not true and laughed at the endings. They formed emotional bonds so quickly that Ketvari could not track them all. Two crew members who had met only days before would speak to each other like they had known each other for years. Lieutenant Commander Katie Grant was the ship's tactical officer. She was a small woman with dark hair and quick hands that moved across her control panels like water flowing over rocks. She noticed Ketvari watching her one day and smiled at him. "You look confused, Ambassador," she said. "I am attempting to understand your social structure," Ketvari admitted. "They do not follow logical patterns." Grant laughed. It was a sound that humans made when they found something amusing, though Ketvari could not identify what was funny about his statement. "We're human," she said. "Logic isn't really our thing. We run on coffee and stubbornness mostly." Ketvari added this to his notes, though he suspected she was not being entirely serious. He also spent time with the marine company that served aboard the Resolute. There were 80 of them, led by a man named Ryan Cole. Cole held the rank of Sergeant First Class, which meant he was responsible for the soldiers under his command. He was not a large man, but there was something in the way he moved that reminded Ketvari of predators he had observed on other worlds. Controlled, patient, always watching. Cole found Ketvari in the observation deck one evening, looking out at the stars. "You're the one writing the report on us," Cole said. "It was not a question. I am documenting human behavior for the Silent archives," Ketvari confirmed. Cole nodded and stood beside him, also looking out at the stars. "And what have you figured out so far?" Ketvari considered the question carefully. The Silent valued honesty. "Your species is young and your technology is limited. Your bodies are fragile compared to many others in the galaxy. Your lifespans are short. By most measurements, humanity is a mid-tier civilization at best. He expected Cole to be offended. Most species became defensive when their limitations were pointed out. But Cole just smiled. A small movement of his lips that did not show his teeth. Fair enough, Cole said. But measurements don't tell you everything. Ambassador. Stick around long enough and you might see something that doesn't fit in your categories. HFY did not understand what he meant. He filed the conversation away and continued his observations. 3 days later, everything changed. The Resolute received a distress signal from a Veloci colony on the edge of contested space. The message was broken and filled with static. But the words that came through were clear enough. The arrow swarm had found them. They were dying. They needed help. HFY felt his secondary heart stop for a moment. The arrow swarm was known across the galaxy. They were not a species in the traditional sense. They were more like a force of nature, a wave of biomechanical predators that moved from world to world, consuming everything in their path. They had destroyed 17 civilizations over the past 10,000 years. No one had ever stopped them. The Galactic Council had learned long ago that the only response to the arrow was to evacuate and run. He went to the bridge and found Captain Morrison staring at the tactical display. The data was not good. The arrow had deployed over 40,000 drone forms around the colony. The Veloci defenders were already overwhelmed. By the time any rescue force could arrive, there would be nothing left to save. Captain, HFY said, the mathematics of this situation are clear. The colony cannot be saved. The Galactic Council has already classified it as lost. Any rescue attempt would be suicide. Morrison did not look at him. He was still staring at the display. At the small dot that represented a world full of people who were dying right now. At this very moment. How many civilians? Morrison asked. Katie Grant checked her screens. Estimated 12,000, sir. Including a shelter with about 400 children. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to look at HFY, and the ambassador saw something in those calm blue eyes that he had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something else entirely. Something that the Silenti had no word for. Ambassador, Morrison said, you're about to see something that doesn't fit in your categories. He turned to his crew and spoke 5 words that HFY would remember for the rest of his very long life. We're not leaving them behind. The bridge of the Resolute became very quiet after Captain Morrison gave his order. HFY looked around at the human crew members, expecting to see fear or confusion on their face. Instead, he saw something strange. They were nodding. Some of them were even smiling, though not the kind of smile that meant happiness. It was something harder, something sharper. Katie Grant was already working at her station, her fingers flying across the controls. Plotting intercept course, Captain. We can be in orbit in 6 hours if we push the engines to maximum. Do it, Morrison said. HFY stepped forward. His translator struggled to express the urgency he felt. Captain Morrison. I must object to this course of action. The Arrow Swarm has 40,000 combat units surrounding that colony. You have 300 crew members and 80 marines. The numbers do not work. This is not bravery. This is mathematics. Morrison turned to look at him. There was no anger in his expression. Just a kind of patient understanding that made HFY feel like a child who had asked a foolish question. Ambassador. I've been doing this job for 23 years. Morrison said. I've learned that mathematics doesn't always tell the whole story. Those people down there are counting on someone to help them. If we don't go, no one will. That's all the maths he need. HFY wanted to argue more, but he could see that it would be pointless. The decision had been made. He retreated to the observation deck to record his notes, certain that he was about to witness the destruction of the Resolute and everyone aboard. In the marine barracks, Sergeant Ryan Cole gathered his soldiers. They stood in rows, their faces serious but not afraid. Cole walked between them, checking their equipment, speaking quiet words to each one. HFY watched from the doorway, recording everything. Listen up. Cole said when he reached the front of the room. You all heard the distress call. Velozi colony, 12,000 civilians, 400 kids in a shelter. The Arrow have them surrounded. Command says the colony is lost. The council says rescue is impossible. The council says rescue is impossible. He paused and looked at his marines. Anyone here care what command and the council say? A ripple of dark laughter moved through the room. One marine, a young man named Ben Torres, raised his hand. Sergeant, what's our objective? Get down there, kill anything with too many legs, and bring those people home, Cole said. Simple enough for you, Torres? Torre grinned. Simple enough, Sergeant, Cole nodded. We drop in 6 hours. Get your gear ready. Get your heads ready. And remember what we fight for. The Marines responded as one voice. Each other. Kedvari recorded this exchange and added a note about human group bonding rituals. He still did not understand why they were so willing to die for strangers, but he was beginning to suspect that understanding would come whether he wanted it or not. The 6 hours passed quickly. Kedvari spent most of it on the bridge, watching the crew prepare for battle. There was no panic, no hesitation. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. But there was something else too, something beneath the surface, an energy that Kedvari could not name. When the Resolute dropped out of faster than light travel, the Velozi colony appeared on the main screen. It was a small world, mostly brown and gray, with patches of green where the colonists had built their farms. From orbit, it looked peaceful. The tactical display told a different story. The Arrow swarm appeared as a cloud of red dots surrounding the colony's main settlement. 40,000 drone forms, each one a biomechanical nightmare designed for killing. They had evolved over millions of years to become perfect predators. Their bodies were armored. Their claws could cut through steel. They felt no pain and no fear. They existed only to consume. Katie Grant's voice was steady as she read the data. Arrow anti-air coverage is dense, Captain. Any drop pods we send down are going to take heavy fire. Probability of successful landing? Morrison asked. Grant hesitated for just a moment. 60% of pods should make it through. Maybe. That meant at least 30 Marines would die before they even reached the ground. Kedvari waited for Morrison to reconsider. Surely now he would see reason. Surely now he would understand that this mission was hopeless. Morrison turned to the communication officer. Patch me through to Sergeant Cole. Cole's voice came through the speakers a moment later. Cole here. Captain. Sergeant, you heard the numbers. 60% chance of landing. That means we're going to lose people on the way down. I need to know if your Marines are still willing to go. There was a brief pause. Kedvari could hear voices in the background, the sound of Cole consulting with his soldiers. Then Cole spoke again. Captain. I just asked my people that question. Every single one of them is ready to drop. We know the risks. We know what's waiting for us down there. And we're going anyway. Those kids in that shelter are counting on us. Morrison nodded, even though Cole could not see him. Good luck, Sergeant. Bring them home. Will do, Captain. Call out. The drop pods launched 15 minutes later. Kedvari watched on the tactical display as 80 small dots separated from the Resolute and began their descent toward the planet. Almost immediately, the Arrow anti-air defense opened fire. Bright lines of energy cut through the atmosphere, seeking the falling pods. The first pod was hit 12 seconds into the descent. It disappeared from the display, taking 3 Marines with it. Another pod was hit. Then another. Kedvari counted the loss. 7 pods destroyed before they reached the lower atmosphere. 23 Marines dead in less than a minute. He waited for the remaining pods to turn back, to abort the mission, to recognize the futility of what they were attempting. They did not turn back. The surviving 57 pods continued their fall, weaving through the Arrow fire, their pilots pushing their skills to the limit. Kedvari watched one pod take a glancing hit that should have destroyed it. The pod spun wildly, completely out of control. Then somehow, the pilot stabilized it and continued the descent. On the bridge no one spoke. Every eye was fixed on the display, watching those 57 dots fall toward a world filled with monsters. Casey Grant's hands were clenched so tightly on her console that her knuckles had turned white. Captain Morrison stood perfectly still, his face unreadable. The pods hit the ground in a scattered pattern around the colony's main settlement. 57 Marines, armed with rifles and determination, against 40,000 arrow drones. Ketvari began recording what he believed would be the final moments of these brave, foolish humans. He had no idea how wrong he was. The first transmissions came through moments after landing. Cole's voice, calm and controlled despite the chaos around him. All units, this is Cole. Sound off, and converge on the central shelter. We have civilians to protect. Move fast and stay together. Today we show these things what humans are made of. The battle for the Velozi colony had begun. Ketvari had access to the helmet cameras of every marine on the ground. He watched through their eyes as they fought their way through streets filled with arrow drones. What he saw in the first hour of combat forced him to delete his preliminary assessment of humanity and start over from the beginning. Private Ben Torres was one of the first to engage the enemy. His pod had landed in a market square that was already swarming with arrow. He hit the ground running, his rifle firing in short, controlled the burst. The arrow were fast, but Torres was faster. He moved through them like water through rocks, never stopping, never hesitating. Then a arrow spike caught him in the left shoulder. The biomechanical projectile punched through his armor and buried itself in his flesh. Ketvari had seen this wound before, in recordings from other battles. The pain alone was enough to incapacitate them. Torres stumbled. He looked down at the spike sticking out of his shoulder. Blood was already soaking through his uniform. Any rational being would have fallen back, sought medical attention, or simply collapsed from the shock. Torv braced his rifle against a shattered wall and kept firing. Torres, you're hit, came a voice over the radio. It was Corporal Megan Price, fighting her way through a nearby alley. I noticed, Torres replied. His voice was tight with pain, but his aim did not waver. I'll deal with it later. Right now we have work to do. Ketvari made a note in his log. Humans apparently had the ability to simply ignore wounds that would disable other species. He did not understand how this was possible. He added it to his growing list of questions. The Marines converged on the central settlement over the next 2 hours. They fought every step of the way. The arrows were everywhere, climbing over buildings, bursting from underground tunnels, dropping from the sky on membrane wings. For every one the humans killed, 3 more seemed to take its place. But the humans kept pushing forward. Corporal Price found a group of Velozi civilians hiding in a collapsed building. There were 2 adults and a child, all of them injured and unable to walk. The extraction point was half a kilometer away, across open ground that was crawling with arrow. Price was already wounded. She had taken hits to her leg and her side, and she was leaving a trail of blood behind her as she moved. The logical thing to do would be to mark the location and send someone else to retrieve the civilians. She did not have the strength to carry them all that distance. Price picked up the Velozi child and put him on her back. She helped the 2 adults to their feet and began walking. Price, what are you doing? Cole's voice came over the radio. You're in no condition to make that trip. These people need to get to safety. Sergeant, Price replied. I'm going to make sure they get there. She walked that half kilometer with 3 Velozi depending on her. She fought off 2 arrow attacks along the way, firing her rifle one-handed while keeping the child secure with the other. When she finally reached the extraction point, she handed the civilians to the medics and then collapsed. She had lost so much blood that she should have been unconscious hours ago. The medics could not explain how she had stayed on her feet. One of them, a young man named Danny Ortiz, just shook his head and said, "That's just what we do." Ketvari recorded this as well. He was beginning to see a pattern, though he still could not explain it. The battle reached its peak when the arrow breached the central shelter. This was where the Velozi had hidden their children, 400 of them, ranging from infant to adolescent. The shelter was supposed to be impenetrable. The Harrow had found a way in. Cole received the alert and immediately redirected his force. By this point, he had only 19 marines still capable of fighting. 19 against the 600 Harrow drones that were converging on the shelter from all directions. Cole gathered his remaining soldiers in a corridor that led to the shelter's main entrance. It was narrow, barely wide enough for 4 people to stand side by side. The walls were reinforced concrete. There was no way to flank them, and no way to retreat. This is where we hold, Cole said. Nothing gets past us. Nothing reaches those kids. Understood? Nothing reaches those kids. Nothing reaches those kids. The 19 Marines understood. They formed a line across the corridor, shoulder to shoulder, and waited for the Harrow to come. They came in waves. The first wave hit the Marine line like a crashing tide. Claws and spikes and razor-sharp appendages slashed through the air. The Marines fired until their rifles overheated, then switched to sidearms. When the sidearms ran dry, they used the knives and fists and anything else they could find. The corridor filled with the bodies of the dead. Human blood mixed with the strange fluids that passed for blood in the Harrow. The Marines stepped over their fallen enemies and kept fighting. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. Cole lost his rifle somewhere in the second hour. A Harrow drone had knocked it from his hands and he had not had time to retrieve it. He drew his combat knife and kept fighting. When the knife broke, he picked up a piece of metal from a destroyed drone and used that instead. By the 4th hour, only 11 Marines were still standing. They were surrounded by a wall of Harrow corpses so high that new attackers had to climb over it to reach them. The floor was slick with blood and other fluids. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of death. And still they held the line. Kedvari watched through Cole's helmet camera as the sergeant faced another wave of Harrow. Cole was bleeding from a dozen wounds. His armor was cracked and torn. He should have been dead many times over. A Harrow drone lunged at him, claws extended. Cole caught its arm, twisted, and used the creature's own momentum to throw it into the wall. Before it could recover, he was on top of it, driving his improvised weapon into its central nerve cluster. Another drone came at him from the side. Cole spun, blocked its attack with his forearm, and struck back with a blow that would have shattered stone. His helmet camera picked up his face for just a moment. He was smiling. Kedvari did not understand. This man was dying. He was surrounded by enemies. There was no logical reason to smile. But Cole was smiling anyway, and in that smile, Kedvari saw something that his 400 years of observation had never prepared him for. He saw joy, not the joy of victory, because victory was far from certain. Something else. Something pure. Cole was smiling because he was exactly where he wanted to be. Doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was protecting those who could not protect themselves. He was standing between innocence and evil. He was being human. The reinforcements from the Resolute broke through 20 minutes later. They found 11 Marines still standing in that corridor, surrounded by the bodies of over 400 Harrow drones. The wall of course was so high that the rescue team had to climb over it to reach them. Cole was still on his feet when they arrived. His knife was long gone. His hands were bare and bloody. But he was still standing, still ready to fight. Still guarding the door to that shelter full of children. Sergeant Cole, the rescue team leader said, his voice filled with the something between awe and disbelief. We're here to relieve you. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded and finally allowed himself to sit down. About time, he said, I was starting to get tired. Behind him, 400 Veloci children were alive and unarmed. Not a single Harrow had gotten past the line. The evacuation of the Veloci colony took 3 days. The Resolute was joined by 2 other human ships and a Veloci transport that had been hiding in the outer system. Together, they pulled 12,000 civilians off the planet, while the remaining Harrow forces watched from a distance. Kedvari found this strange. The Harrow still had over 38,000 combat units available. They had lost less than 2% of their total force in the battle. By any reasonable calculation, they should have continued their attack. They should have overwhelmed the evacuation ships and consumed everyone on the planet. Instead, they did nothing. They sat in their positions around the settlement and watched the humans work. They made no move to interfere. When the last transport lifted off, carrying the final group of Velozi refugees, the Harrow simply let it go. Kesvari requested a meeting with Captain Morrison to discuss this development. He found the captain in the medical bay, visiting the wounded Marines. Cole was there, his body wrapped in bandage, connected to machines that were slowly repairing the damage he had suffered. He was awake and talking to Morrison when Kesvari arrived. Ambassador, Morrison said, nodding in greeting. I hear you've been recording everything. Got some good footage? I have recorded events that I do not fully understand, Kesvari admitted. I was hoping you could help me make sense of them. Morrison glanced at Cole, and something passed between them. A shared understanding that Kesvari could not read. Ask your questions, Morrison said. Kesvari organized his thoughts carefully. The Harrow swarm has consumed 17 civilizations. They have never retreated from a battle. They have never shown fear or hesitation. Yet today, they allowed us to evacuate an entire colony without interference. Why? Cole laughed, though it clearly caused him pain. Because we scared them, Ambassador. That is not logical, Kesvari said. You killed approximately 2,000 of their units. They still outnumber you by a factor of nearly 20 to 1. There is nothing to be afraid of. Logic, Cole said, shaking his head. You keep coming back to that word. Let me ask you something, Ambassador. In all your years of watching species fight and die, have you ever seen anything like what happened in that corridor? Kesvari considered the question. He had seen many battles. He had watched a species fight with advanced weapons, with overwhelming numbers, with clever strategies. He had seen courage and he had seen cowardice. He had seen victory and defeat in all their forms. He had never seen anything like what the humans had done. No, he admitted. I have not. That's your answer, Cole said. The Harrow are predators. They understand prey. They understand how species behave when they're threatened. They know that most beings will run when the odds are against them. They know that most soldiers will break when their friends start dying. They've been doing this for millions of years. They've got it figured out. He paused and his eyes grew distant, as if he was seeing something far away. But we didn't run. We didn't break. We came down here knowing we were probably going to die, and we fought anyway. We held a corridor for 4 hours against impossible odds, not because we thought we could win, but because there were children behind us who needed us to try. Morrison picked up where Cole left off. The Harrow don't understand that. Ambassador. They can't. Their entire existence is based on calculating risks and rewards. They attack when they can win and retreat when they can't. Everything they do makes sense from a survival standpoint. Humans don't always make sense from a survival standpoint. Kesvari said slowly, beginning to understand. Exactly, Morrison said. We do things that don't make logical sense. We sacrifice ourselves for strangers. We charge into certain death because someone needs our help. We keep fighting when any rational being would have given up long ago. Kesvari thought about Torres, continuing to fire with a spike through his shoulder. He thought about Price, carrying 3 wounded civilians half a kilometer while bleeding from multiple wounds. He thought about Cole, smiling as he fought with his bare hands against creatures that should have torn him apart. You are saying that the Harrow retreated because they could not predict your behavior, Kesvari said. I'm saying they retreated because they finally met something scarier than themselves, Cole replied. We showed them that there's no amount of pain, no depth of fear, no weight of odds that will make us stop fighting for what we believe in. And that terrified them. Kesvari spent the next several weeks analyzing the data from the battle. What he found confirmed what Cole and Morrison had told him. The Harrow had never encountered a species like humanity before. Every other civilization they had faced had behaved according to predictable patterns. When the losses became too great, they retreated. When the situation became hopeless, they surrendered. When their leaders fell, their armies collapsed. Humans did none of these things. The Harrow had watched soldiers continue fighting with wounds that should have killed them. They had watched officers lead from the front instead of commanding from safety. They had watched a species throw themselves into certain death without hesitation, not for territory or resources or survival, but for the sake of strangers they had never met. The Harrow's predictive model could not account for this behavior. Their entire strategy was based on the assumption that all species would eventually break under enough pressure. Humans had shown them that this assumption was wrong. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Harrow swarm faced uncertainty. They did not know how to fight an enemy that did not behave like prey. They did not know how to predict the actions of beings who valued others more than themselves. So they retreated to reassess. They would spend the next decade studying humanity from a distance, trying to understand the mathematical impossibility of human courage. Reports began to filter in from across the galaxy. The Harrow had stopped their advance on 3 different fronts. Colonies that had been marked for destruction were suddenly safe. Species that had been preparing for extinction were given a reprieve. The Galactic Council demandait en explanation. The Harrow had never stopped before. Something had changed. HFY submitted a preliminary report to the Silent Collective. In it, he described what he had witnessed on the Velozi colony. He described the drop pods falling through enemy fire. He described the Marines holding the line. He described the look on Cole's face as he fought with nothing but his hands and his will. The report was classified immediately. The elder archivist declared that it was too dangerous for general distribution. They did not want other species to know what humanity was capable of. But the truth spread anyway. Stories of the battle at the Velozi colony passed from ship to ship, from world to world. Species that had never heard of Earth began to learn the name. Species that had dismissed humans as insignificant began to pay attention. And everywhere, beings who had lived in fear of the Harrow swarm began to hope. Because if the humans could make the Harrow retreat, then maybe the galaxy was not as hopeless as it seemed. Maybe there was still a chance to fight back against the darkness. HFY watched this change spread across non-space. He watched species that had given up begin to rebuild their defense. He watched aliens form where none had existed before. He watched the galaxy start to believe in something it had forgotten long ago: hope. The humans had given them hope. And HFY began to understand that this was perhaps the most terrifying thing about humanity of all. HFY remained aboard the Resolute for 6 more months after the battle at the Velozi colony. He watched the humans go about their lives, trying to understand what made them different from every other species he had studied. He attended their celebrations and their mourning ceremonies. He listened to their stories and their songs. He asked endless questions and received answers that only led to more questions. On his last night aboard the ship, he sat with Captain Morrison in the observation deck. The stars spread out before them like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, the Harrow swarm was still waiting, still watching, still trying to understand the beings who had made them afraid. "You're leaving tomorrow," Morrison said. It was not a question. "I have collected enough data for my final report," HFY replied. "The Silent Collective is waiting for my conclusion." Morrison nodded slowly. "And what will you tell them?" HFY had been thinking about this for months. He had rewritten his report dozens of times, trying to capture what he had witnessed. Every version felt incomplete. Every analysis fell short. "I will tell them that I was wrong about humanity," he said at last. "When I first came aboard this ship, I believed that your species was unremarkable. Your technology is limited. Your bodies are fragile. Your lives are short. By every measure that the Silenthy use to evaluate civilizations, you should be insignificant." He paused, searching for the right words. "But I have learned that our measures are incomplete. They count what a species can do, but not what a species will do. They calculate capabilities, but not character. They measure power, but not purpose." Morrison smiled slightly. "And what have you learned?" About our purpose. You fight for each other, HFY said simply. Not for territory or resources or survival. For each other. For strangers you have never met and will never see again. For children hiding in a shelter on a world far from your home. He thought of Torres, still firing with a spike in his shoulder. He thought of Price, carrying wounded civilians through enemy territory. He thought of Cole, standing in that corridor with nothing but his hands and his determination. The Harrow have consumed the Fontaine civilization, HFY continued. They have destroyed species older and more powerful than humanity. They have never been defeated. But when they faced your marines in that corridor, they saw something they had never encountered before. They saw beings who would not stop, could not be broken, refused to give up even when logic demanded it. We're stubborn, Morrison said with a small laugh. You are more than stubborn. HFY replied. You are inexplicable. The universe operates on certain principles. Energy moves from high concentrations to low. Systems tend toward disorder. Life seeks to preserve itself above all else. These are laws that govern everything we know. He turned to look at Morrison directly, his multiple eyes focusing on the human's face. Humanity breaks these laws. You expend energy protecting others when you could conserve it for yourselves. You create order from chaos through sheer force of will. You sacrifice your own lives to preserve the lives of strangers. This should not be possible. The mathematics do not support it. And yet here we are. Morrison said. And yet here you are. HFY agreed. This is why I believe the stars shudder before you, Captain. Not because of your weapons or your ships or your armies. But because you represent something that the universe has no defense against. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. What's that, Ambassador? Love, HFY said. I have studied your language and I believe this is the word that comes closest. You love beings you have never met. You love ideals you cannot touch. You love the idea of a future you may never see. And this love makes you do impossible things. He rose from his seat and walked to the window, looking out at the infinite darkness. The Silenti have observed the galaxy for millions of years. We have seen empires rise and fall. We have watched a species evolve and go extinct. We have documented every form of warfare. Every type of civilization, every pattern of behavior that intelligent life can produce. He turned back to Morrison. We have never seen anything like humanity. You are an anomaly, Captain. A variable that does not fit any equation. A force that cannot be predicted or controlled. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Morrison asked. HFY considered the question carefully. I do not know. You could save the galaxy or destroy it. You could be the greatest force for good that has ever existed or the most terrible weapon ever unleashed. The potential in your species is beyond anything I have encountered. He walked back to his seat and sat down again, suddenly feeling very old. But, I will tell you what I believe, Captain. I believe that when darkness comes for the galaxy, when the Harrow swarm or something like them threatens to consume everything we have built, humanity will be the ones who stand against it. Not because you have to. Not because it makes sense. But because there will be children in shelters who need someone to protect them. Morrison did not respond for a long time. They sat together in silence, watching the stars turn slowly outside the window. Thank you, Ambassador, Morrison said finally, for seeing us, for understanding. Thank you, Captain, HFY replied, for showing me that the universe is bigger than my equations. The next morning, HFY departed the Resolute and returned to Silency Space. He submitted his final report to the elder archivists, and as he had expected, it was immediately classified at the highest level. Only a handful of beings would ever read his conclusion. But the truth of his words spread anyway. Carried by the stories of what had happened at the Velozi colony, species across the galaxy heard about the humans who had descended into certain deaths to save strangers. They heard about the Marines who had held an impossible line. They heard about the Harrow swarm retreating for the first time in 10,000 years. And slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to change. Alliances formed where none had existed before. Species that had hidden from the Harrow began to emerge. Worlds that had given up hope began to rebuild their defense. The darkness was still out there, still hungry, still waiting. But now there was something else out there too. There were humans. Years later, when Kesvari was asked why he had devoted so much time to studying humanity, he would always give the same answer. Because I watched them step into combat, and I finally understood why the stars shudder before them. It is not fear. It is awe. The stars look upon humanity and they see something that should not exist. Beings who shine brighter than logic allows, who burn hotter than mathematics permit, who love more fiercely than the universe can contain. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are not the oldest or the wisest or the most advanced. But they are the ones who will fight for you when no one else will. They are the ones who will stand between you and the darkness, even if it costs them everything. That is why the stars shudder. That is why the arrow fled. That is why I believe that whatever challenges the future may bring, humanity will face them as they have always faced them. Together. Unbroken. Unafraid. And the universe will never be the same. The final line of Kesvari's report, the one that the elder archivists quoted most often in the centuries that followed, was simple and direct. Do not threaten what humans protect. Do not harm what humans love. Do not test what humans will endure. Because I have seen the answer, and it is this: there is no limit. There is no breaking point. There is no force in all the cosmos that can make a human stop fighting for what they believe in. The arrow learned this lesson and fled. The rest of the galaxy would be wise to remember it.